Hey y'all. Seeing a lot of arguments lately about who is and who is not a racist. So I figured it might be useful to talk about how to tell, and it might be most useful of all to talk about not how to tell if somebody else is a racist, but how to tell if you are, because that's like the hardest thing to do for a lot of folks. That might seem silly, because I know racism often gets boiled down to being someone who hates people of other races or something like that. But that's not the full picture. Racism in our world doesn't just run on hate and bigotry. It's often the culmination of a lot of subtle, often learned biases, things that kind of shape you as you grow up in the world you're born into. Things like the idea that people living in bad parts of the city are there because they're lazy, they're criminals, or otherwise deserve it somehow. Which, if you know a thing or two about American history and how cities were built up in this country over history, you'd know is a very silly thing to think. But those beliefs, especially when you've got them, they don't feel like hate. Some of them are so common in this country that growing up, they feel like common sense. Because if you don't know the history, character flaws like that are an easy explanation for some of the differences that we see in our society. So like that, racism can be kind of subtle to the person who has it. And that doesn't make the people who have those biases bad or stupid. People in general are predisposed to all sorts of biases, and they wouldn't be so reliable and predictable and exploitable if they were obvious to the people who had them. Trust me, I work in communications. Marketing pretty much works on our biases. That's how people get you to buy stuff. So in that way, there are the stereotypical hateful bigot racists, but then there's another kind of racism that's kind of like BO. Not in the morality of it. Racism is bad and BO is just kind of one of those things. But in the sense that when it's sticking to you, you might not be able to tell. At least that was the case with me, because I can tell you right now, I had a lot of racist beliefs growing up. Some of them I only let go of recently. But some of them I knew a long time ago were wrong. So let's talk about a test. Let's talk about one question you can ask yourself that might give you a hint if you've got BO, the BO that is racism. And then if you get this hint, you can decide whether or not you want to look into it more to really make sure that you don't have the BO that is racism, or whether or not you want to deny it and risk being that person who other people don't want to be around and they don't know why. Now, for the record, with this analogy, I know that sometimes BO can be like a medical thing. So if that's you, I'm sorry. This analogy is not perfect. But the test. When you're alone, or not alone, but with other white people, or alone, when black people aren't around, whether it is in things that you think to be jokes, whether you're talking about history even, really any scenario. Ask yourself if you are comfortable using the N-word, saying that word, and if you're cool with it around other people who do the same thing. Okay, take a deep breath, because I'm sure, just based on what I know about the people that I grew up around, and myself, I'm sure that there are a couple people right now who are comfortable with that and are also very confident that they are not racists. And I would understand if y'all are offended right now that I would even suggest such a thing. I know that used to be my reaction. But it's a real good test, and I would really like you to consider it, and here's why. You see, I used to be one of those people. I've never used that word directed at an individual out of anger, but I didn't shy away from, in the right crowds, I didn't shy away from racist language in quote-unquote jokes, or discussing history and social issues with other white people, singing songs, reading books. I didn't shy away from that word if I were with other white people. And I certainly didn't think I was racist. I didn't think I had the hate in me. And so it went that as I got older and I wanted to really, this is something that I cared about because I'm very much like a freedom of speech person. That's sort of how I justified it to myself. And I wanted to learn more about that word and the history so that I could sort of justify some of those actions to myself. So starting at slavery over the course of years, starting before college and going into it, I took the time to learn. Not just reviewing the history that I learned in primary school, grade school, but really trying to dig into other parts of history and just learn about the history of racism in America. You see, that's the thing. As I did, it turned out I didn't even know what I didn't know. I did not know the full history of that word, the fine details of how and why it got used, by whom, what they really meant when they used it, what that word really meant to the people who were given it. And as I learned more about that history and the depths of the injustice that this nation allowed to happen, not only allowed to happen, but baked in to so many of its institutions that are around today. God, I still remember the one that still remember the point when I was reading up on this history when I realized, wait a minute, this whole racism thing is not what I thought it was. And I've mentioned this before. It was when I learned about redlining. Because I was living in North Philly at the time, it really kind of cleared a lot of things up. And as I learned about all that, naturally, I was no longer comfortable using that word. Because as I learned about the history around it and about the other people who looked like me in America that used that word, what it meant to them, what it meant to the people who received that label, what it meant to the folks who took it back, the idea of even having that shit come out of my mouth became deeply uncomfortable. I didn't want to be another person in this country's history who had the gall to utter that word. So I stopped saying it. And that's why, whether or not you're comfortable with that word, as a white person, as somebody who would not be called it, that can tell you a lot about whether or not you're missing something in your own assessment of where you're at with this stuff. Because for people who use that word, there's really only two options. Either A, you do not have a good understanding of the history of that word. Because if you did, using it would make you uncomfortable. You might think that you do. But again, if you're comfortable with it and you think that you do, I would look up the Dunning-Kruger effect first. And it's okay. It's an effect that applies to everybody. Certainly applied to me when I was comfortable with that word and thought that I knew a lot of shit that I didn't know. But if that's you, I would start at the beginning, slavery, and using sources written by black historians because they tend to have the most skin in the game, especially for the majority of our country's history where most white historians could not care less. That's where you'll get the full story and learn it. I want to say slavery to about the year 2000. There's been some dumb stuff after the year 2000, but if you can stick with it up to the year 2000, that'll give you a pretty good picture of why things are the way they are today. Anyway, if you do all that, and you understand that history, and you've really internalized it, and you're still comfortable with that word, which implies that that history is not impactful to you, and you are okay with knowing that that word came out of your mouth, then the second option is you might have more hate inside of you than you think. Because with that word, those are really the two options. You either don't know or you don't care. And if you don't care, that's the one that says a lot about your character. If you don't know, then, hey, this is your chance to choose to know and to be a better person. Maybe help make this a better country. Anyway, racism really is sneaky. It really is sneaky. There's a lot of biases that I'm still working out of my system. Even though on the topic of the story that I kind of talked about, I became uncomfortable with that word, I want to say like 4 years ago. 4 or 5 years ago. But there are still biases that I'm working out of my system. Just the other day, I saw some folks standing around my car outside where I live. I live in Camden. There's a lot of black people in Camden. And if you want to know why, again, history. There were some people standing around my car, not even around it, just kind of next to it. It's like a week ago. And I looked out my window and my first thought was, what the hell are they doing to my car? And I immediately caught myself and I was like, why am I assuming they're doing something bad to my car? I've got binoculars. I looked out, they were smoking a cigarette. But here's the thing. If they were some people who looked like me, I don't think my mind would have jumped there first, because that criminal association is something I'm still working out of the subconscious part. And I'm sharing all this because I think when talking about racism, a lot of people who look like me make it about a contest. Who can be the least racist? Who can prove that they were never racist? Who can prove that that's not a problem for them and it's a problem for other people? And, well, if you are super sensitive about it, you're super sensitive about it just because you're scared of being called a racist. I want to be abundantly clear. When you really learn about this stuff, it's not a fear of being called a racist. I can do that myself. I was. It's about a fear of being a racist, because that is gross. And it becomes grosser the more you know about it. Or at least it should. Anyway, been meaning to get this off my chest for a while because I'm hoping that some folks might hear this, folks like me maybe 10 years ago, and go, I'm really comfortable with that word. Maybe I shouldn't be. Anyway, thanks for listening. Have a good one.